Okay, subscribers and visitors, friends and followers, good afternoon. I'm here to release another video. This video is actually a follow-up on the video I published about 2 weeks ago called Young Earth versus Old Earth, an Evidential Approach. And as usual, this topic generates a lot of discussion, a lot of opinions come out. Some of the opinions are quite firmly held, and the conversation gets a little warm. And releasing this slide deck was about the same. It's as I expected. I didn't go into enough depth, I think, to handle most of the questions, particularly the 3 or 4 really big questions, and a number of the details over on the science, the secular side of matching up the days of creation. So what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and do a follow-up and focus on those 2 or 3 areas we need some more information on, and take a little bit deeper dive. We're going to start by looking at how do we get into this controversy. I don't think either I realize or many folks realize at the start just how controversial this can be. And then after we cover how we got into the controversy, we'll focus on those 3 or 4 areas where we have serious questions and I need some more information. We'll do a deeper dive, right? All right, now last time I started off with a prayer. I explained that because this is an issue that is non-salvational, one of the things we have to deal with is the extremes of the 2 opinions. On the folks that believe in the science, they reject the biblical point, the theos point, out of hand. Don't even want to talk about it. And likewise, there's a number of folks on the Bible side, the theistic side, that flat out believe if you don't believe the earth is a certain age, that you're going straight to where you don't want to be going, right? So I think we're going to start with a prayer just to set our expectations up front and make sure we get our attitudes adjusted. So with that in mind, you can read along with me. Our Lord and our Father, we are about to embark on a discussion that is often filled with unanswerable questions, firmly held opinions, and deep emotions. We approach you now to say thank you for not making this topic a salvational issue. You instructed us to love you with all of your heart, all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. As we engage in this mindful analysis, please help us to avoid a haughty attitude and understand that our thoughts are so inferior to yours. Let us open our minds to both of your inspired revelations, the Holy Spirit inspired book of Scripture, the Bible, and your creation through the Logos, the book of nature. It's in Jesus' name we ask. Amen. Okay, how did we get into this controversy? Why should I worry? All right, if you are already a saved Christian, you believe in God, Jesus, the Bible, don't get nervous, don't get worried, be happy. There is nothing, I believe, nothing in here that if you choose to study along with me with an open mind and consider it, that's going to cause you to lose your salvation. The Bible clearly says what is salvational and what is not. If you look at any good translation, New American Standard, English Standard, NIV, the King James Version, New King James, it says clearly, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. That's over in 1 John 5:13. So what's it saying? If you believe, all right, that's the God in the Bible. If you believe in God in the Bible, and you believe in the name of the Son of God, that's Jesus, that you may know you have eternal life. You notice what's not in there? The Bible clearly says what is salvational, and the age of the earth isn't one of them. So with that setting behind us, let's say that if you are already a saved Christian, don't worry. For you, this is shareable information. Now, what do we mean by shareable information? information that you can use to talk with a secular or scientific-based person that's having some doubts about the science versus the Bible and is open to at least listening to and talking about it. There's a lot of information here you can then share with them to get them to maybe analyze it, do a little review of it, and see if it might be applicable to them. Now, on the other side, if you are a secular or scientist and you are avoiding Christianity simply because of the science, then I think you need to look at this evidence with an open mind. In fact, both sides need to look at the evidence with an open mind and ask yourself, could this be true? Because if it is, then there is a middle ground. How did we get into this controversy continued? When and why did it start? Well, actually, it goes back more than 1,000 years. Back at the first century or two after Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection, it was not controversial. This was not something that churches split up over. The founding fathers held many beliefs. Some thought it was a 24-hour day in Genesis 1. Some thought a day was like 1,000 years. Some felt it was just an unknown long time. Some felt it was just an order of things and not time at all. The problem that they ran into was perhaps we're writing analogies for A&E readings. Let me explain that. A&E stands for Ancient Near Eastern. Ancient Near Eastern Hebrew people, the society back then, used an ancient Near Eastern level of Hebrew that was not near as capable and technical of handling the sorts of things that we know today. We know literally thousands and thousands more things than they knew back then. Obviously, we couldn't tell them, go Google it. There was no Google. There was no internet. So the inspired Bible, as written thousands of years ago to the ancient Near Eastern Hebrews, had to be understood by the ancient Near Eastern Hebrews in a language and an environment and a society that they could understand and relate to. And so therefore, to try to explain some things that technically are really complicated, but they couldn't understand the complication, then the writer of the book had to use analogies, kind of sort of like similarities, things of that nature, to get them to understand the concept, the God concept that was trying to communicate. Remember, the Bible was not a science textbook. It wasn't designed to answer all the chemistry and the physics and the math. It was a book to talk about God and who God is and how we relate to him. So they needed enough understanding back in the A&E level to understand it. And that made for some possible difficulties here. Then along came Charles Darwin. This is November of 1859. He wrote the book On the Origin of the Species. This book literally was an overnight sensation in the scientific and secular world. The first printing was about, I think, 1,200 copies, and it literally sold out in a matter of days. It became a very, very popular book. And the whole origin of the species concept is based upon random mutation and natural selection. Let me explain that. The DNA in our bodies, in our chromosomes, in our cells, is subject to mutation. Things like radioactive waves going through the body and so forth, various chemical things could cause the DNA to get different, get messed up. It's called mutated. And most of those mutations end up being either not showing up, they just don't bother expressing themselves, or worst case, they kill the animal. In college, we used to do it in the genetics class. We did a lot of work with what's called fruit flies. And we tried all different ways of mutating the genes of fruit flies, reproducing them, and see if they reproduce. And it doesn't matter what we did to a mutated fruit fly, we either got a weird looking fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly, or a normal fruit fly. We never got horseflies or never got dragonflies. We certainly didn't get mice or elephants or people. Only thing we got were flies, okay? So that's random mutation. Natural selection says if one of those mutations is good for the animal and it lives long enough to reproduce, does that characteristic get passed on? And if it gets passed on to a number of generations, a number of individuals, then it kind of stays in the population. Now, the concept is, over time, if a random mutation occurs, and it doesn't occur often, and it manages to keep the individual alive long enough to reproduce, which is not guaranteed, and in the reproduction function, it either reproduces with another animal that also has that mutation, or at least the mutation persists through generations until another mutation happens to make it better and better. In other words, if the mutation improves the animal's success at reproduction, then it is transmittable, it's viable. What we find out that all of those ifs that I just talked about takes huge amounts of time, massive amounts of time, a lot more than 6,000 years. So random mutation, natural selection, it sounded good up front until we really started diving into it. And then we realized probability says it's not looking too good. So why was that a controversy? Well, what happened was evolution, the idea that we could start with some goo in a floating pond of chemicals, end up with an animal that we see in the zoo, and several generations come up with me and you, the probability of that, they didn't think about it, okay? They just didn't think about the probability too much. They just assumed that because there was a process that I can go from the goo to the zoo to you, what I didn't need anymore was creation. Genesis in the Bible talked about God creating. If I can get there via evolution, then I didn't need creation. And if I don't need creation, I can pretty well say the Bible's not important, which means, there goes God and everything about him. So evolution is basically what eliminated creation because of the time and the low probabilities that it caused. The age of the earth at that point became a salvational split. It was so important to those folks back then that they literally would, if a Bible person met up somebody with a long old earth view, they would be convinced that he's going straight to hell. Likewise, if a scientist talked to a creation person, they think that he's lost his mind, unable. So it literally became back then a salvational split view. What about today? What's this trending today? The question is it really a problem of age of the earth, or is it evolution and creation? Is that what we're talking about? Well, up until several decades ago, age actually saved creation from evolution. What do I mean by that? Several decades ago, well, let me back up even further yet. Prior to several decades ago, the fact that the evolution had lots and lots of age, therefore it could evolve, killed creation. That logic chain was enabled it to kill creation. But then a couple of decades ago, the age problem really didn't drive evolution anymore because evolution was so low probability, hard to come by, that it began to become disfavored, and the disfavoring of evolution actually saved the concept of creation. So now creation is back as a very possible liability. Example, a guy by the name of Michael Behe back in '96, he published a book called Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. This concept, he took biology and chemistry and math, specifically probability, and by looking at the combination of how chemistry, chemicals become bigger chemicals, become more complex chemicals, become proteins and so forth and so on, all the way to the point where that supports what we call life, biology. When he started looking at the probability of those things happening, he realized that it was not very good. But there were examples that we could see today that did appear to be evolving. Ends up with a micro and a macro evolution, two of them. Microevolution is observed today. We call it adaptation or variation. Let me give you some examples. Bacteria. If you're in the hospital, sometimes you hear about this horrible thing that could happen to you called getting MRSA, MRSA. And basically this is a infections condition that could really, really hurt you. In fact, I think there have been people that have died from it. MRSA is methyloxin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Okay, that's a mouthful. MRSA. Staphylococcus aureus is basically a bacteria. And what happens when they give you a drug to kill Staphylococcus aureus, a antibiotic, it doesn't all get killed on the first pill. And sometimes you have to take the thing for 4, 5, 6 days, a week or so. And by the end of the week of taking that drug every day, you eventually kill more and more and more each day until you've killed it. You've good and killed it. Most people start feeling better after about 2 days and they stop taking it. So what happens is we've got some Staph aureus that have not yet been killed. Why? Because they're resistant a little bit to low doses. But if they can last 4 or 5 days and then it stops, they actually live. So every time this happens, that particular bacteria gets stronger and stronger. He adapts to the point where we have a disease or a medical condition called MRSA. The SA is resistant to the M. They're still around, they're still dangerous. So that's bacteria. Finches. You've heard about finches in the Galapagos Islands, sometimes referred to as, I want to change the screen rate, let me back up. All right. These finches will have, apparently they all came from the same finch, but they have different sized beaks. As it turns out, the difference in the shape and the size of the beak is a function of what they're eating. And as the weather changes and different things are available, the beak is changing. Last one, moths. This is an example of a moth that is both, sometimes it's kind of whitish, sometimes it's speckled with dark brown and black color. And in England, during the Industrial Revolution, as more and more smoke was dumped into the atmosphere and caused soot to form on things, then the soot settling on the moth that was white turned the moth kind of darkish, yucky gray and brown, and the birds couldn't find it, therefore they didn't get eaten, therefore they lived longer, and the population started looking more brown. It evolved. But after we cleaned up the smokestacks, then the brown ones started becoming white again, and the birds started finding them, and they got eaten again. So the population was actually being affected by the smoke. It was adapted to the smoke. All right, so that's micro. What about macro evolution? Macro is the evolution of non-life, just plain chemicals, into life. And it is statistically impossible. I can follow it up with you another day on another presentation, but the statistics of non-life becoming life chemically is so far out there that even billions of years is not enough time to pull it off. It has to be created. Macro is also a single cell life that just got formed impossibly. The single cell life now evolves into a complex life form. That means we're going literally from single cells to multi-cells to little animals to bigger animals, complex animals to you and me. Again, the statistics, it's not there. It's impossible. It needs creation, and it needs creation intervention. needs creation to get started, and it needs creation intervention to move it from one step to the next. All right, so science isn't really threatening creation. Science is actually threatening macroevolution. And if we can get rid of the macroevolution part, we still have the microevolution, but creation is now on firm footing. So now that we got the creation on firm footing, can the Bible accept an old earth? All right, old earth, lots of years, tempting to go with evolution, but we know it's not possible statistically. Can the Bible accept an old earth and creation? All right, let's look at it. Will the Bible allow both old earth and creation? So, the popular translation of Genesis 1 and through chapter 11, is that the only correct one? Is the interpretation that we read today or hear preached from the pulpit on church or read in our religious documents, is that the only interpretation that is correct? Well, maybe not. We need to start looking at the actual words that are written in the Bible and analyze them for different ways of interpreting. Remember I said Hebrew A-N-E back then. They didn't know anywhere near as much as we do now. They didn't have as many words. They had very few words actually, and very simple, much simpler language. So if they had to explain something that was complicated, they were left out. So what happens is, they didn't have enough words to explain all the different things. What happens is a thing called polysemy. Any one particular word could end up meaning more than one thing. So if polysemy is in operation and words have different translations, then it's possible that you can end up interpreting a word more than one way. All right, so what does that mean? Let's look at this POV. POV stands for point of view. We need to understand whenever you're doing an analysis, studying something or a scientific project, the first thing you got to do is you got to decide what is the point of view, who's running it, who's doing it, and what point of view are they starting from. People with different points of view have, again, come up with different answers potentially. Another thing is starting conditions. What are the starting conditions before the change? Different starting conditions can end up producing different results. And like we already mentioned, polysemy, the object of there is to understand of the several explanations that interpretations that could come from a single word. Which one does it mean here? And with that, we've got to obviously do a little research and find out how many different ways the word can mean what it means. And also, and most importantly, context. Within the context of the chapter or the verse or the story, how does this word fit in best? We're going to look at the days 0 through 7, and we've got to keep in mind the POV, the starting conditions, and polysemy. All right, let's look at some of the inconsistencies. The question was, is Genesis 1 through 11 as interpreted the only way? Well, it has some inconsistencies. For example, light, let there be light, before they created plants. But we have lights being used for the days and the seasons, being created after light formed on another day. You see, maybe it's not internally consistent. The sequence of things. A busy day 6. On day 6, we have creation of the animals. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself again. We have creation of the animals. Then we've got creation of man. And then we've got man naming all the animals. And we've only got 24 hours to do it. That's a busy day. That's a busy day. So there are some inconsistencies on the surface that makes you want to do a little more research. Are there any other biblical references to creation to help clear up some of these inconsistencies? Yes, there's lots of them. When you're talking about creation, People focus on Genesis chapters 1 through 11 and think that's all there is that to talk about creation. Creation is mentioned, explained, inferred, described in many, many books, many, many places in the Bible. There are references, good references, explanatory references in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, Exodus, Numbers, Malachi, Jeremiah, Colossians, Acts, Hebrews, and James. All of these different books have references to creation, references to things we need to understand in creation, like God is unchanging, God never lies, God tells the truth, things like this. The things we need to do the analysis, we need to look at more than just Genesis 1 through 11. We got to look at the whole Bible. All right, let's look at some of the pitfalls in the comparison of science and Genesis 1 through 11. The timeline of Genesis 1 and 2 to the timeline of universe evolution. Is it reasonable? Is it not reasonable? Well, as it turns out, if you study it with an open mind between the science and the Bible, there are actually reasonable explanations where both can be true. So that's a good thing. We're going to look at some of them. But there are other pitfalls. Another big pitfall that we have is the Noah flood. The Noah flood, basically, if we have an old Earth and a Noah flood, we got problems with the timeline. Falls apart quickly. So there are some suggestions. There's a number of theories out there, and although they haven't really answered the question to the point where, as a scientist, I would be comfortable with it, they're getting close. They're getting plausible. And as we learn more about the science, we may end up finding things that are more compatible with the timeline of the Noah flood in the Bible. And then lastly, the chronogenealogical evidences of Adam and Eve. What's that? The chronogenealogies. Those are the Adam begot his son, and his son, he lived so many years, had a son, then he died. The son lived so many years, begot somebody else, and died, and so forth. We call it the begots. And there's a number of begots between Adam and Abraham, and then there's another series of begots between Abraham and Jesus. So, but if you go through the Bible and look at carefully the years definitely add up to something a lot less than a million. In fact, it's probably closer to 6,000 to 10,000, depending on how you look at the genealogies. So that's one that puts the Adam and Eve original what date, that's difficult to nail down. And we don't have a lot of information on that. Recently, there have been 3 different books published on that. All 3 of them sound reasonable, but the 3 of them don't agree. So that's not a nailed down topic yet. But the nice thing is, it's not prohibited either. They all have reasonable portions. Anyway, so those are the 3 pitfalls we need to deal with. So if the Bible is all you need, then why the pushback? Why are people getting all bent out of shape? Well, the Old Testament was written to an A&E Hebrew society, all right? And if you don't understand that, you're going to push back on Genesis as written in the Bible. If you don't understand that there is an A&E Hebrew society that does not look like the society today, and you have to talk with them differently. It's the goal of the Old Testament was not to be a science document. It was not meant to explain everything. It is meant to explain God. Right? It is not a scientific treatise or an encyclopedia of everything. And sometimes we try to make it that, but it really is not. It is a document built around the understanding of God and Jesus, the history of man and the relationship to them, and what's necessary to get back in favor with them. That's it. Okay. Basically, in Genesis, we got the fall. In Revelations, we got the rise, and everything in between is the story of how you get redemption. All right. It uses analogies to explain not yet known things. Anytime we're writing to a people that don't understand what really needs to know, and they don't yet know it, we use an analogy to something they do know that they can relate to. And as we learn more, we can understand that this is just an analogy for a more complicated issue. What about the modern secular society pushback? Why are they pushing back? Well, we talked about the polysemy versus the expanded vocabulary. If you don't understand, again, the fact that polysemy versus our vocabulary is vastly different in terms of ability to describe things, then you can end up pushing back on the Bible because the words that they use as interpreted commonly are not correct, or at least stretching the context. Modern secular pushback might include incomplete and non-specific analogies versus today's knowledge base. This is introducing a concept known as the God of the gaps. If we don't understand something, as a theologian, as a Bible scholar, do we say, well, God did it? In other words, we throw God in there to explain what we don't know. In the science world, if you don't understand something, you go to the government, you get a bigger research budget, more experiments, hire more people, study it some more, and fill in the gap. So those two are quite different. God of the gaps versus a more research, more money needed. Modern secular society will look towards that gap as we'll get the answer sooner or later versus you're just going to nail anything to God. Things like, I'm hitting the wrong button again. Science filled in the blanks. I'll give you an example. Back centuries and centuries ago, when we had a thunderstorm and we had loud noises and bright lights flashing across the sky, back in those days, they didn't understand weather. They didn't understand thunderstorms, lightning. So the gods of back then, literally, we had a god of thunder and a god of lightning in the Greek society. The gods will handle it. Well, as soon as science came along, starting to study weather, and found out that the boom was the air rushing back into the gap left by the lightning, and the lightning was just a big static discharge, same thing you get when you slide into your dry, cold sheets at night on a winter day, zap, or reach over and touch your puppy dog, spark up. Nowadays, we understand that. So as science fills in the knowledge, we tend to, or at least the folks that believe in God of the gaps, they tend to have fewer gaps to have to believe in. Science just says, keep going, we'll fill in all the gaps. And therein lies the problem. Science does, in fact, fill in many of the blanks. But unfortunately, it cannot fill in all of the blanks. And that's another topic we mentioned briefly, that if you don't imagine there exists answers outside of the time-space material of the universe, then you never will find the answer of some of these gaps. All right. The secular scientist is going to say, well, you say that God is unchanging and consistent and truthful, but I'm coming up with all sorts of things that say God does change. He's not consistent. He's not necessarily truthful. I'm getting research evidence that points to things that don't show up in your Bible, or I can't find anything that does show in your Bible. So that sometimes is a pushback. Let's just go ahead and compare and contrast the Genesis 1 and the science. So I think we've covered mostly the source of the controversy and the big major question Q&A between the secular and the theist in terms of how the Bible is written and how it's to be interpreted and how we should use context carefully to interpret it. Let's look at the science side. What about the science side? Does it compare? Is there any way to come together on this? And there are a number of of good research projects, good scientists doing some research that say, yeah, it actually there is a middle of the road that does make sense, that you can believe in, and it agrees with the Bible, or at least doesn't conflict with the Bible. Let's go ahead and look at some of these. All right, so we're comparing Genesis 1 and nature. All right, let's look at the Bible side. And I know this is going to be hard to read, but bear with me. So day 0, not day 1, but day 0, we have up through Genesis chapter 1, verses 2 and 2. So we're looking at day 0 from the beginning up through verse 2. Well, verse 1, let's look at the POV. Okay, let me jump ahead and I'll come back to POV. Day 1 is Genesis verses 3 in chapter 1 through 5. And in that light, we're talking about light. We're talking about, let there be light. Light's created. Here's this POV. Notice that there is a large change in the point of view between that. And if you skip over it, you will definitely be missing a big part of the middle ground. Day 0, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Let's look at that carefully. What's the point of view? Point of view is God. The point of view is God outside of the universe that he's about to create. Okay? We need something to do the creation. I call it God. Other people may call it other things. But if I'm going to create something, I have to be around before my creation happens. So my point of view is outside of the universe, looking in as I create the thing. In the Hebrew, the word, the Barashit Bara Elohim is the first words. In the beginning, God created. Barashit Bara Elohim. The word Barar is only used with a God-initiated act, a divine act. It's only used very, very infrequently throughout the Bible, and all the references are that God must do the creating. There are other words for creating things, for building things that are new. Asa, Dasa, Nata, these are all Hebrew words that talk about creation, but it does not need God. Another area is that Barar tends to mean, in most of its areas where it shows up, that it is coming from nothing. It literally is coming what's called ex nihilo, from nothing. So when you create something from nothing, that's a lot of different creation than creating like a nice birthday cake from flour and water and eggs and milk and so forth. What you start with in that kind of creation is already here. When you do a bara creation, there is literally nothing there to start with. All right. So bara is God initiated. It's a divine act. It is ex nihilo, and there are other words for creation to cover the other reasons we create. Let's look at the rest of that. So it's bara is Barashit bara Elohim Hashemayim v'ha'eres. So that's the original Hebrew. And the original Hebrew, basically the Hashayam v'ha'eres is the heavens and the earth. And it refers to the total physical universe. All right. Shamayim is the heavens, Eres is the earth. And the Bara says you're getting everything from nothing. What that means is the universe includes all the time, the space, the matter, and the energy. The real kicker there is it also includes time. In the beginning, Barashit, the creation of the beginning, there is nothing before time. You cannot even ask the question, where was God? What was he before creation? The word before needs time, and it hasn't been created yet. So that's an interesting topic we can talk about someday. But anyway, so it includes the total physical universe, and matter and energy in the scientific world is really the same form. It's a variation of the same thing. E equals mc squared from Einstein. Energy is equal to matter squared times the square of the speed of light. So matter and energy go back and forth. You can have different forms. So it's time, space, and we call those two together material. Time, space, and material, TSM. So you'll often hear me refer to the universe as being everything in TSM, time, space, material. All right, now let's go ahead and notice that the point of view changed going over to verse 2. Let's look at verse 2. Verse 2 says, day 1, Genesis 1, 3 through 5, and it has to do with the light. Notice, first of all, first ask yourself the question, what's the point of view in verse 2? In verse 2, God is now sitting on the planet Earth, above the waters, hovering over the waters, and it is dark. He cannot see anything because the sky is totally clouded over with stuff that doesn't let light come through. So God is hovering over the waters of the earth in a dark environment. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the POV has shifted from outside of the universe to the surface of the earth. How much time is there between those two things? How much time between the beginning of the universe to the point where Earth now exists and it's all water and God's sitting there under the clouds hovering over the waters? We don't know. We're not told. It could be minutes, days, years, thousands, millions, billions of years. We don't have the answer. Now, science thinks they do have the answer. The Bible people don't think about it. Most people, if they do think about it, they think about it as part of the first day. But that may be a problem. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what do we got here? We got the earth. The earth is consisted of the core of earth, the dirt, the solid rock of earth. And it's covered by an ocean. And it's surrounded by an atmosphere with dense particulates. Is this only Genesis we're talking about? Well, no. The ocean is described in Psalm 104:6. The atmosphere with its dense particulates is defined very clearly in Job 38, verse 9. And the concept of God hovering over. If you look at Deuteronomy 32:11, the same Hebrew word for hovering over refers to an eagle brooding its young in a nest. So maybe the analogy is that God is hovering over these waters, breathing life in the waters to begin the process of becoming ultimately man. All right, so that's verse 2. Let's look at the next one. Day 2, Genesis 1, 6 through 8, waters and the atmosphere. All right, so day 1, verse 3 starts off with, let there be light. Let there be light. The Hebrew word is hayah, and hayah, to create light, is not equal to bara, create light. Hayah, we interpret that is, let there be light. God said, let there be light, and there was light, implying that it was immediately created. Well, as it turns out, that hayah is the equivalent of to having existed prior, not bara, but hayah. Well, if light existed prior to when God was on the surface of the earth, hovering over the waters under the clouds, so thick that you couldn't see it, it might very well be that the light, stars, were created before the earth. The light was out there, but you couldn't see it at the surface. And there's nothing in those words, that very small Hebrew sentence, that says, no, differently, it couldn't happen. That's an interpretation, which we need to look at the context. And God said, let there be light. The concept of God said, the word said, in Hebrew is the word amar. And it basically means it means said. So when God said something, the act of speaking it or thinking it or enunciating it somehow, that God saying something is what initiated that particular creation of that thing. And God said, let there be light. And he called the light day and the dark night. So it kind of looks like there is a sun out there that's producing light and dark, day and night, but it's happening under the clouds. Can't really see it. The key there is God said. The reason why I make a big thing about that Amar word, said, is the word said is used throughout creation in Genesis to indicate a type of creation happening. And we'll get some more of that in a minute. The other two words I want to look at is in verse 3. Evening, which is ereb, and morning, which is boker. So evening and morning, ereb, boker, is used to define a day. The word for day is yom. So as they use evening and morning, Genesis is saying this is a day. In the last presentation, I talked about yom and how yom could be a really, really, really long time, finitely. Well, this is the morning and evening. So when God said there was light, that was what he accomplished on that evening and morning. And we really need to look at all the things that could happen that would produce light. Like, for example, the creation of the universe with all the stars and galaxies giving off light. All right, we're still in day one. How can we see this light ever if we're covered up by this dark cloud of particulate matter? One of the things that is presented, and this, by the way, is called the day-age theory. One of the things that's presented in the day-age theory is that sometime during that first period of time, a planetoid, a small, another planet, comes plowing into the Earth and blows away most of the atmosphere. And I'm sitting here thinking, maybe I'm going to go, let me save this discussion till the second half of this when we look at the science side. We'll come back to that. Let's look at the rest of the biblical side of Genesis. So day 2 is the waters and the atmosphere. It's when God creates the waters, let the waters above and the waters below, and the atmosphere. Day 3, Genesis 9 through 13, is raising the land out of the waters and creating the plants. Okay. Day 4 is the creation of the heavenly lights. The heavenly lights being the stars, the moon, and the sun. We can now see them. So the light was created way back on day 1, but on day 4 we can actually now see them. All right. Day 5, Genesis 1, 20 through 23, he creates the sea creatures and the birds. All right, we'll spend a few minutes on that in a minute. And then on day 6, Genesis 1, 24 through 31, he creates the land animals and ultimately he creates man. All right, so that's from the Bible point of view. And if we read it strictly from that point of view, it's 6 days. We ignore the day 0, consider it part of day 1, 6 days. On the 7th day he rests. All right, let's look at the science side. All right, now we're looking at the boxes across the bottom. The Big Bang to the Earth. So what is the Big Bang? Both the science and the Bible both agrees that the Earth, the universe, was created from nothing, from an instant, from an infinitesimally small and dense and heavy particle that blows up and becomes the universe. Okay, so God said, "Bang! Let there be light," and the universe is created, and it expands out to this huge bubble that we see today. And likewise, the science and the Bible both say it happened from a point. Call it a singularity. All right. time of that singularity to the time when Earth exists. That singularity, it starts out very, very hot, very, very dense, and expands. Huge sizes, big, huge expansion. And it cools down, and eventually it cools down to the point where light can form. So the energy becomes photons, the photons become light, and the light can be seen as the quarks and whatnot become particles and become atoms, and the universe becomes transparent. This is all happening in just the first few seconds, minutes. Then this matter that's formed, it condenses into galaxies, stars and galaxies, and the stars blow up and produce matter, and the universe again floating around, and more stars are formed. The chemicals that we use today, and the first stars are just hydrogen and helium, and then maybe a little bit of lithium. And then after several generations of stars blowing up, producing heavier elements, eventually we get to the point where today our star, our sun, has all up the heavy elements through uranium and up in that area, iron and all the different metals. That process from bang to the Earth condensing out of all the dust and the material into an Earth and cooling down to less than 100 degrees centigrade, less than the boiling point of water. That whole process, it basically goes, according to the science, from 13.5 billion years ago to 4.5 billion years ago. Okay, and that's called the Big Bang. So we have time, space expanding, energy condenses and matter forms, energy cools to the visible, and light, stars, and galaxies form. All right, so that's day 0. Remember, verse 2 of day 0, we're already on the Earth. So this is verse 1 of Genesis 1. All right, so now we're on the Earth. God's on the Earth. He's hovering over the waters, and he's starting to take care of his creation. But we're still dark. So what does that mean for us? Well, let's take a look at that one. How do I get rid of all this dust and solid material that's blocking out the sun, that's making it so dense? By the way, it's very similar to, for example, the planet Venus today has a cloud so dense that you cannot see the stars, the sun, or the sky or anything like that. So it's not impossible to be like that. We got some of that today in Venus. What happened, and again, what they're proposing is what happened is during that first, probably million or so years, another planet, a planetoid, about maybe 1/9 the size of the Earth, smashed into the Earth, banged right into the Earth, and it blew that atmosphere almost completely away. All of that crud and dust and dirt that was in the air was just ejected. Likewise, part of the planetoid ended up sticking with our Earth. Heavy elements consolidated. We end up getting a molten core of iron and then different layers of the Earth. And much of what was thrown out from this impact was kind of clouds of this material around the Earth in orbit. And over the years, the clouds of material condensed and fell together, gravitationally came together, and formed the moon. Okay, so basically the moon collides with the Earth. The collision blows away most of the atmosphere, almost all the dust, not all of it. Basically, it blows away enough so that you can see the light, but it's still translucent, kind of like on a cloudy day. If you imagine outside on a cloudy day, you can still see the light from the sun, but you really can't see the sun itself. It's kind of translucent. It's short, dusky cycles. All right, so that is on day 1. All right, let's look at day 2. All right, day 2 runs from 3.8 billion to 2.6 billion years ago, and now we have the water cycle and the atmosphere forming. What's that? So we started off with a water planet, and the The water planet, we had a heavily dense atmosphere above and a sea of water below. As the translucent happens, the sun begins to heat the waters. Now we get hot waters that will give off water vapor, that will rise and cool, form rain, and the rain back to refill the oceans again. And that's called the water cycle. And we need that water cycle in order to support life. So from 3.8 to 2.6 billion years ago, the water supply starts up, and we start to get what is called today plate tectonics. The center of the Earth is heating up from all these radioactive elements that were formed, and the heat is forming little cycles of circulation. If you put a pot of water on to boil, you can actually see the water is kind of circling as it heats up, and those circulation patterns causes the stuff near the surface to start moving around. The stuff near the surface, still under the water, but near the surface, is cooling down. It's crystallizing into solid rock. And now the rock is being pushed around. It's called plate tectonics. We also start getting some shallow seas. When you're over these hot spots, you get shallow seas of not yet land, still underwater. And these shallow seas gives a place for anaerobic microorganisms to start forming. So this is where we see the first life, the single cells. And they start producing oxygen, not a lot, but they start producing oxygen. There is no oxygen in the water. So these are anaerobic, without oxygen, microorganisms. And that's happening on day 2. Then on day 3, we see continents. I'm reading across the bottom again. 2.6 to 2.4, continents and photosynthesis. So this continued plate tectonics, moving around, generating movement of the blocks of now hardening up crust. And they bump into each other, and some of them actually emerge out of the water as landforms. Okay, and they form what we call continents. And these continents go bouncing around and sticking together and breaking up and so forth. By having the continents up out of the water, we start to get landforms, and at the same time, there are chemical reactions now taking place in the waters and along the edges of these shallow seas, a process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is taking some of the carbon dioxide that is heavily in the atmosphere and turning it into oxygen. So these early green plants floating in the water, shallow seas, are starting to produce oxygen. The oxygen in the atmosphere tends to, the combination of the oxygen and some carbon dioxide in the atmosphere tends to reduce temperature swings. So instead of having almost boiling to freezing and back to boiling and so forth and so on, the temperature levels out. And again, we need a level temperature in order to have life. So that's day 3. All right. Another thing I'm say about day 3, though, as I mentioned that waters gathered together to dry land. Again, is it only Genesis? No. We talked about that in Psalm 33:7 and Job 38:8 all the way through 10. So the plants on the land are the plants on the water, which is beginning to rise, the land through it. We start to get some plants on the land. And lo and behold, on day 3 is when we have land and plants formed through this tectonic and shallow seas and green plants getting pushed up on land and having photosynthesis, day 3. Also notice that he saw it. Let me introduce this concept. Remember we talked about God said Amar, and it was created. Well, the other half of that pair of words is called Ra'ah, and that is God saw, S-A-W. So basically each day in God's mind is defined by starting with a Amar, ending with a Ra'ah. He saw that it was good. So when he saw that it was good, Amar to Ra'ah, he saw that it was good. He it states that is an evening and a morning. So evening, Arab, morning, Boker, is the way we define day 3. Okay? So starting around the beginning of the Bible, in the beginning of the Genesis, we have this definition of a day as God saw, Amar, God said, created it, Amar, saw, it was good, Ra'ah, and then morning and evening, Arab, Boker. And we can look in the rest of Genesis for these pairs to see where a day happens. All right, now let's go ahead and look at day 4. Day 4. Here we go. All right, so day 4 goes from 2.4 billion to about 580 million years ago in the science world. Now, the atmosphere has essentially become transparent. The oxygen has eaten up most of the stuff in the air, and it's almost as transparent as it is today. We can see all the stars and the planets and the moon and the sun and so forth and so on. So those are the heavenly lights that we talked about, the heavenly lights. Also, in the science world, it was called these slush ball events. Remember I said the temperature swing is starting to drop, but it has not yet dropped so much like it is today, fairly constant. When you've got the water cycle working and water vapor becoming rain and falling as snow or ice or slush or whatever you want to call it, hail, then that cycle, if it's still having temperature extremes, can literally freeze up to the point where most of the Earth gets covered with snow and ice. And maybe except for the equator area. And then a couple of thousand years later, it warms up a little bit because the snow and ice is reflective, reflects the sun back out, lets the Earth cool down, the snow melts. Now you can, when the snow melts, the sun can now get into the ocean waters, which absorbs the sun, gets hot, and we have these cycles, hot, cold, that are called literally slush ball events. And that's happening during day 4 from 2.4 billion to 580 million years ago. All right, let's look at day 5. Where is day 5? Here we go, day 5. All right, day 5. God says, Amar, make some sea animals. And he made some sea animals and some birds. And he says, it's good. All right, Ra'ah. First he says, sea animals, it's good, Ra'ah. And then he goes back and says, I'm going to make some birds. Now, the birds introduce an interesting concept. The birds are interested in the concept of soulish animals. The animals that were created first, the lower level animals, the kind of slightly multicellular, all the low level animals, basically just they eat and die, eat, reproduce and die, eat, reproduce, die. They don't have a lot of thinking going on. They're almost all running on instinct. The concept of soul is now introduced. That's the word nefesh in Hebrew. Having a soul basically means in the Hebrew, in the A in the Hebrew, means you now have enough brain power. So you don't have to worry about just running on instinct. You can start thinking. And as you start thinking, you can start forming relationships. And ultimately, when you get to the higher orders of birds and mammals, you actually start forming relationships within a family that allow you to nurture the children. Rather than just fertilizing the eggs and dumping them out there, you now have children that you nurture and raise and take care of. And this is considered a soulish activity. Okay, like for example, elephants. When you watch an elephant lose a child, they will literally hover around that child and mourn for days before they move on. And birds, as a classic example of an animal that nurtures the young, literally carries food to the nest and feeds the young and teaches them how to fly. And quite often they'll stay together as a family unit. So that is the nefesh. And then after he creates birds, we have another evening and a morning, and now we're at the end of day 5. All right, day 6. Day 6 goes from 538 million to 130,000, and this is considered the Cambrian explosion and glaciation. So what is it? So day 6, God said, Amar, create land animals, and he saw it was good, so he says Ra. And then he said again, Amar, he creates man. And he saw Ra, that man was very good. Evening, morning, day 6. All right? That's day 6. What is this Cambrian explosion and glaciation? This is an example of creation replacing evolution. Statistically, all of these changes, from single-celled animals to multi-celled animals to plants with chlorophyll that make photosynthesis work, plants to making animals and crawling out of the sea and becoming land animals, all of these major transitions from one body form to another is creating what in science called phyla. And these different phyla have so much different from the one before it that accidentally there's not enough time through mutation and natural selection to get there. You cannot create a monkey out of a starfish without some creation. There's just too much, there's just not enough change to make evolution work. So in day 6, what's happening is we have spurts of intense creation. And one of these spurts is the Cambrian explosion, about 500 and some odd million years ago. And we go from just half a dozen or so phyla to like 25 or 30 phyla. Major changes. And it's during that period of time that we start to see the things like fish and land animals and gorillas, or pre-gorillas, trilobites, all kinds of body forms. And that's happening during this Cambrian explosion. Not gorillas. They come way later. Reptiles and so forth. All right, day 6. I'm going to add one more to here. That's the Cambrian. All right, I'm going to add one more here, which is like 6 plus. From 130,000 to 15,000 man. Now here's one of the places where we don't have solid science to nail down when man was created. Okay, Adam and Eve. Was it 6,000 years ago, as the Bible says? Was it further back than that? And why do we even worry about it? Well, we've got evidences of man, and we know that he is definitely nefesh. He's souling, and soulful. And he also begins to show things like society. And he shows amazing things like burying your dead. Why would you bury your dead? Because you think that they may go somewhere afterwards. The dead body is worth more than just a body. They literally have a soul. And examples of things like cave art or burials in burial chambers with burial pots and some materials and some food and some jewelry to go on with them is an example of a man-like activity. And those we have today going back in much more than 6,000 years, more than 10 or 15,000 years. So it's possible that Adam and Eve were created as man with, in addition to soul, created with the image of God, which is why you'd want to think about life after death. The image of God gets pushed back somewhere between 130,000 and 15,000. Obviously, that falls apart when you look at Genesis, which is also one of the reasons why Genesis is having a hard time explaining, science is having a hard time explaining Genesis in terms of the genealogies. Remember I said the chronogenealogical evidence, and that's why. Okay, that's why I have a problem. All right, so that is man. We're up to 15,000 years ago, and then from 15,000 on is basically where we are today. All right. Yeah, Homo sapiens. That's us. All right. Let's bring this to a close. Summarize it. So what are we saying here? It's young Earth and creation, old Earth and evolution are probably incompatible. So we looked at the young Earth creation. If you have a young Earth and it's only 6,000 years old, and you can get everything you need by creating it, and we know that God can do that. I mean, he can certainly create anything he wants, any way he wants, anyhow he wants, anytime he wants. He can certainly do it. He has the power and the ability and the intelligence to do it. But if you assume that everything we see today was created in less than 6,000 years, then that requires scientifically a lot of changes to occur in physics, chemistry, and biology and math. And yet at the same time, the Bible clearly tells us that God is unchanging in his ways, always truthful, never lies, and he does the same thing today as he did forever and ever back early on. Well, in order to get things like, we talked about that, sunlight or photons of light coming had to be adjusted for the redshift. You got things like moving all these plates around. Well, yeah, God can move them. But in order to move a plate the size of North America, a couple of thousand miles, if God is unchanging and it uses the same amount of energy to move then as it does now, moving that plate would literally expend so much energy, the earth would remelt and we wouldn't stand a chance. And other things. The depth of the water for the Noah's flood, was it the whole earth or part of the earth? So anyway, things that we are fairly comfortable with scientifically today requires, if God is constant, consistent, uniformitarianism, unchanging, then we need more time to do all of these things. So that begins to fall apart. So young earth and creation have some issues. On the other side, old earth and evolution, it also has some conditions, some issues. If it's old, we certainly have the time for all of these changes to be happening, from energy into photons and into quarks and then atoms and ultimately stars and galaxies. These things don't happen overnight. So it takes some time. And the old earth has the time to do that. The problem is when old earth cannot even handle evolution. There's not even enough time, even in 13.5 billion years, there's not enough time to pull off even chemistry to a single cell of life. Ain't enough time. There's not enough time in 15 billion years to take that single cell and produce you and me. There just ain't enough time. So the old earth explains some things, but also, excuse me, basically wipes out evolution. The old earth with today's science basically says creation, evolution can't happen. So we're back to creation. So it's got some issues, but interestingly enough, creation is standing strong through both of these. We need creation to do the Bible version, and we need creation to handle the evolution old earth version, which means old earth is really old earth creation. So the answer is tending towards old earth, but creation. As they stand now as separate processes, they're probably incompatible. So what does that mean? Old earth creation is worth evaluating. It's worth looking at. So if you're a secular scientist and want to know a little bit more about this, there's some places I can recommend for you. There's an organization called Reasons to Believe, Dr. Hugh Ross, and he wrote a book called Navigating Genesis. It's got a lot of good information about it and basically looks at this sort of stuff. Another book is I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. That was written by Dr. Frank Turek and his mentor, Norm Chrysler. That's another book you can look at if you want a little bit more about it. So anyway, so to the Christian, I absolutely thank you and I praise you and for being a Christian. I think you've got it right. That's where I'm sitting, and I'm feeling very comfortable with that. And I really believe we can talk about this sort of stuff, particularly to help those who are not yet Christians to see what we call the light. And there's a lot of information here you can use to talk to those folks. If you have any questions, please post a comment, and we can certainly talk about it. If you are a secular or a scientist, or you're being pressured into that by the society around you, and the colleges and the schools and so forth, then I hope you can maybe review this material with an open mind. And if you are interested perhaps in Christianity, then put this behind you, give it a shot, give it the possibility. Maybe read that the book that I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And so that's what we've got. Hopefully this answers your questions. Again, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to put it in the comments. I usually check my comments every couple, 3 days, and I'll try to answer as best I can. And then in the meantime, oh dear, I went over an hour and 16 minutes. I apologize again. I just talked too much. But anyway, in the meantime, thank you for watching, and go with God.